Hello, and welcome to the second video in the High Score series. In this video, I'll take a brief look at how video game music has developed since the arcade era, break down the standard roles and responsibilities of a game's sound development team, and take a closer look at a game's production cycle in terms of sound and music development. Please insert coin. The first recorded instance of arcade games can be traced back to New York in the 1920s, although these looked and played very differently to what we might consider a more traditional arcade game, involving ball tosses or shooting galleries. The first pinball machine was created a decade later, in the 1930s. The most important difference between these games and later machines is that they were made of wood. No electronics were used to operate them, and as such, the only sounds produced were natural sound effects. In 1966, Sega released Periscope, an electromechanical arcade game which used lights and sounds to simulate battles between ships and submarines. You can see it in action here. This is one of the earliest uses of sound to enhance the player's experience. In addition, it was also one of the first games to charge a quarter to play, and is considered to be the beginning of the popular arcade era for the industry. Following this, more electromechanical games were created, including Pong and Duck Hunt, the latter of which featured volume controls for its sound effects. Fully electronic arcade titles became more popular through the 70s and into the genre's golden era towards the end of that decade and into the 80s. As mentioned briefly before, sound was used in arcade games to enhance the player's experience. However, there are some key differences between the use and composition of arcade music and music composed for more modern titles. Imagine an arcade, a traditional one where machines line the walls and the floor all around you. Which one do you play first? How do you decide which developer to give your quarter and inevitably the rest of your wallet? Which machine catches your attention? Developers used loud music accompanied with flashing game units in order to drown out the other machines and compete for players' attentions. The louder or harsher the music, the more likely they would be to play. Once hooked, the music is used to keep the player playing and paying for as long as possible. To do this, they often celebrate the near wins, which are so common in these machines. Other musical techniques were used to hook the player. Take, for example, the simple beat found in Space Invaders. As the aliens approach, the beat speeds up, mimicking the player's heartbeat as the game becomes more intense. As time went on, sound requirements often drove hardware development, with the need for greater sound quality and usability at the forefront of new technology. While early titles only had one sound chip to use, this soon expanded to two, allowing developers to sound both music and effects simultaneously. In addition to the simplicity of the composition itself, programmers had to work out how to create seemingly endless amounts of music with limited time and storage. They did this by looping short sections of music. These loops come in many forms, including fitting the end section into the opening section, creating a small transition to link them together, or simply having a small silence between the end of the music and the beginning of the repetition. The simplicity of early arcade music did have its downsides, however. Listening to the same short loop over and over will eventually lead to what's known as burnout. To keep the player hooked for longer, the music used to draw them in must be altered and varied to keep them playing. Composers of the time varied pitch, harmony, tempo, and many other properties to do so. How these changed the sound of the game will be described later in the video. These compositional processes were often so complicated and steeped in computer programming that the game's developers would compose the soundtracks themselves. This saved time later, as the music had to be translated into code anyway. Developing technologies. As hardware developed, so too did the complexity of the soundtracks. For example, the Sega Genesis had 4 chips, each with 2 configurations. How these sounded can be seen here. Along with basic sound quality improvements, the complexity of soundtracks also increased. For example, Desert Demolition's music followed the character's movement, speeding up or slowing down along with player inputs. Alongside limited memory and complicated composition methods, sound developers had another major problem to deal with. During the early era of video games, displays mostly used one of 2 formats, NTSC in the US and Japan, or PAL in Europe. The technical differences between these definitions isn't particularly relevant to the series. However, due to the differences in their CPU speed and frame rate, some consoles, like the Atari 2600 VCS, ended up playing varying frequencies for the same note. This variance wasn't structured either. Due to the complex nature of the consoles, the difference in frequency wasn't based on a percentage or a fraction, it changed wildly between notes, particularly low frequencies. For example, the note F5 can be found in the octave above middle C, the middle note on a piano. In standard tuning, it has a frequency of 698.456 Hz. On an NTSC Atari 2600, it would sound like this. And on a PAL Atari 2600, it would sound like this. The consoles produce frequencies less than 1/100th of a semitone apart. This difference is so small, even a trained musician would find it almost impossible to tell the difference. The note E3, on the other hand, is a very different story. In standard tuning, it has a frequency of 164.814 Hz. On an NTSC console, it would sound like this. On a PAL console, it would sound like this. So flat, it would actually be considered as the note D sharp, not E natural. This is a difference of 87 cents, almost a full semitone. These varying differences created huge problems for composers who may find their nice harmony in Europe completely spoiled in America. One solution to this came in 1983, when Musical Instrument Digital Interface, or MIDI, was introduced. By 1991, this software standardised sounds across platforms, transmitting only code rather than actual audio. MIDI used 128 sounds, which would create a similar noise across any platform. It also allowed for various properties to be controlled, such as length of note and volume. In addition to creating a cross-platform standard, MIDI also allowed musicians to compose much more easily. Instead of having to code all of their music straight into the game, they could now use keyboards. The transfer of code instead of sounds also resulted in a huge reduction in how much memory was used. There were some downsides. Initially, there were only 128 instruments available, and while this might sound like a lot, many were taken up by unusual and ridiculous sounds. For example, sound at 123 was seashore, and sound at 125 was helicopter. Later in 1991, General Standard was created, introducing a further 128 variations to the original sounds. As CD-ROMs were introduced, MIDI was gradually dropped in favour of more realistic sounds. As these could only store 72 minutes of standard audio, composers once again had to fight for space. This led to further developments in compression technology, including the use of MP3 files. Into the 90s, a new issue arose: 3D environments. Surround sound required further developments in audio technology in order to properly immerse the player. Software such as Microsoft's DirectX was used to better connect gameplay and sound, and offered over 1,000 MIDI-like channels for composers to work with. It should also be noted that, while falling behind home consoles in terms of technical specifications, handhelds did broadly follow the same path as their more powerful equivalents. That said, Nintendo didn't detail many specifications or changes between generations. Perhaps this could be a sign that they didn't consider sound as important as other aspects? We'll never know for sure. You're hired. Many roles are involved in the development of a game's soundtrack. Depending on the size of the team and their budget, sometimes these roles may be shared across multiple people, or one person may be responsible for multiple areas. It might be easier then to consider each role as a collection of responsibilities that must be met, either by one person or a larger team. The core responsibilities of a sound team include Sound Director. The sound director is responsible for the overall vision and design of all of the game's audio, from soundtrack to sound effects and everything in between. Sound designer. Creating the audio assets to be used in-game is the responsibility of the sound designer. They also manage any sound effect libraries and take charge of integrating these sound effects into the game. Licensing and contracting director. They are in charge of obtaining rights for any licensed music used within the game. They are also responsible for all contracted work, such as voice actors or composers. Audio programmer. The audio programmer develops the tools and interfaces required to integrate audio into the game's engine. In addition to these core roles, many games will also require some of the following. A composer. It goes without saying, but the composer's task is to create the game's soundtrack. They also take charge of any live recordings required. Voice actor. Usually multiple, voice actors provide voicing for any cutscenes or dialogue. They can also be tasked with sound effects such as breathing or grunting. Seize the means. As with the exact role distribution, the production process of a game's audio will vary by publisher, genre and budget. This section will describe the process for an average game, but certain segments or documents may be slightly different or take place at different points. Pre-production. The first step in the development of a game's soundtrack is the creation of an audio design document. This will detail the design and implementation of most of the game's audio, including music and sound effects. Depending on the size and genre of the game, separate music, dialogue, and sound documents may also be used. At this stage, very little of the game will even exist, so these documents cannot possibly contain every single detail. Instead, they act as an important guide to how the game's audio will work more generally. As the project advances, the audio design document will be updated. What might be included in this document? Zachary Curls, a sound developer who has worked on titles including Killer Instinct, Doom, and Marvel Ultimate Alliance, suggests the following points. Cast a wide net around what audio elements must be considered. These include the music itself, its style, instrumentation, recording philosophy and dynamic range, the overall sound design, the use of ambience, sounds made by weapons and items, player feedback, and integration with visual effects, voiceovers. In cutscenes and in gameplay, consider the size of your cast and the types of voices you might need, and technology. Full understanding of the platform needs and limitations, and implementation methods. Establish reference material. This is similar to how artists use references to create new works in similar styles. Carl says, I start gathering any artwork that might help with establishing the through arc for the game, like storyboards, and then start to gather audio assets that would go with these storyboards. make sure the technological specifications are known. This includes memory and streaming limitations, channel counts, availability of DSP, which I'll describe later, and dynamic mixing options. If the game has a multiplayer component, this also needs to be considered. If it's launching on multiple platforms, each platform's specifications must be supported, ideally equally. How the sound will be implemented must also be considered. Clearly define what is and isn't required. This is difficult at the beginning of the project, but as more shape emerges, the audio vision should narrow further and further until clear targets exist. This will ensure the audio fits into the game as part of the whole project. Always keep the goals of the project and the customer as a top priority. Creating a highly polished and incredibly complex soundtrack is all well and good, but it's useless if it doesn't match what the game needs. The audio design document will also help composers, sound developers, and audio programmers work in a similar style. It's important that all aspects of a game's audio are consistent and work as part of a larger whole. Koji Kondo, composer of some of the most famous pieces of video game music of all time, such as the Super Mario Bros. Theme and much of the early Zelda game soundtracks, states that he tries to consider the entire score as one entity when composing. When asked about how he approached the new Super Mario Bros. Wii main theme in an interview in 2007, he says, "First off, it had to fit the game the best, enhance the gameplay and make it more enjoyable. Not just sit there and be something that plays while you play the game, but is actually a part of the game." This approach ensures that each track contributes to the game both as an individual piece of music and as part of a whole experience. After the audio design document is created, spotting will take place. This process determines how ambient sound will be used and implemented throughout the game. This is sound that isn't used for dramatic effect, but to enhance the realism of the player's surroundings. Ambience is a large part of one of our case study soundtracks. Breath of the Wild relies heavily on it to create its world, and I'll discuss its use more in future videos. Films often use on-site ambience, sound recorded on location to better match visuals. Obviously this isn't possible in video games. During the spotting process, developers decide what kind of ambience should be used throughout the game and what cues or inputs might cause it to change. The interaction of sound and gameplay must be considered. This can mean anything from player inputs causing a new sound effect to play, to how the weather progression within a certain area can trigger a transition between two tracks. A music cue sheet is used to organise music with gameplay or other contextual information. Asset lists are created in a similar manner to organise sound effects. During the pre-production stage, very little gameplay material will exist. However, the idea and basic concept of the game will be fairly secure. At this time then, it can sometimes be helpful to create an emotion map, which tracks how the player might feel during several points throughout the game. This map can help composers write music which better suits each of these atmospheres. Finally, a budget and schedule are created. Once again, these will vary depending on the company and size of game. The schedule will allow time for re-recording any voice acting, a large chunk of time for implementation, and finally, testing. Production. As the game enters production, so too does its soundtrack and audio. If any parts of the soundtrack require a live orchestral recording, a scratch track will be sent to an orchestrator. This is a rough draft of how the piece should sound, and allows the orchestrator to expand the composition to orchestral instrumentation. Once that's done, the composer will arrange a recording session, in which most, if not all, of the required soundtrack will be recorded. If spotting didn't take place pre-production, it will happen now, making use of a more playable version of the game. Sound effects will be sourced at this point. These will either be taken from stock libraries, large collections of standard sound effects, or they will be self-recorded. Some companies even have their own dedicated sound effects studios. If sound effects are taken from a stock library, they will usually be sweetened. This means altering or changing exactly how they sound to better fit the individual game, and also to ensure it doesn't sound identical to the same stock effect in another game. Following this, any voice acting required will be recorded. This covers many different categories, including ambient, scripted, AI cues, narration, and dialogue. This is a complex process, as the dialogue must be carefully sorted as to not waste time recording any lines twice. Lines are usually recorded by character as opposed to chronologically, and actors will often voice more than one character, so it's important to avoid the same actor talking to themselves from two different points of view. Once dialogue is recorded, it is edited and set to the matching visuals. If there are any desyncs or mistakes, re-records will take place. Once all dialogue and text is set, localization will take place. This process is a little more complicated than simply translation. Voice acting may be re-recorded with new voice actors. Text must be translated, but also checked for cultural differences or issues with flow. Legal problems may also pop up if licensed music or advertisements are used. In some cases, such as text-heavy RPGs, a full translation of all the game's text and dialogue can take months. In some older consoles, technical aspects may also have differed between locations. Finally, implementation takes place. It's been suggested that this stage alone creates over half of the final audio result. Implementation must create cues for music to play and determine any actions or events which might cause it to change. The music itself must be integrated into the game in code form, and any real-time elements catered for also. If the game's audio uses surround sound, it must be configured at this point, ensuring that the correct sounds play with appropriate balance. Sounds will be mastered individually, allowing for greater dynamic contrasts. Post-production. This final stage consists mainly of dynamic mixing, choosing how loud certain audio is and how high a priority it takes over other sounds. In order to get rid of any clashes, developers must decide which sounds are more important. For example, an important story sound effect will take priority over ambient dialogue. In doing so, realism has to be considered, but it isn't always the main aim. How realistic a soundscape is depends on the overall style of the game. In the mixing process, difficult decisions must be taken in order to prioritise sounds. In addition, testing will take place to ensure that all aspects of the soundtrack are implemented properly. All text and voice acting will be checked for repetition or awkward silences. This will likely take place alongside similar processes for the game's visuals and gameplay mechanics. Compositional techniques. There are many ways in which composers can alter music to keep it entertaining. While some of these may have originated in the arcade era, some are still used in modern day titles. Simple methods may include changing the pitch or harmony of the music. Doing so can help save memory, as the existing material must simply be altered instead of using completely new music. Changing a piece's tonality can turn it into something much more fearful and apprehensive in the minor key, or anticipatory and exciting in the major key. In modern titles, this can be done in real time. Musician and composer Shady Cicada's guide on how to make a Forest Ruins level theme in 5 minutes or less uses a lot of these techniques to their full effect. That example also uses an irregular time signature, one that doesn't fit into 2 or 3 beats. Tempo, rhythm, and the time signature can all also be used to change how a piece of music sounds. Tempo is usually changed in relation to time-based properties, such as a player approaching their time limit, creating a sense of urgency. Changing the time signature of a piece often can make the player excited or create a chaotic atmosphere. A good example of this can be found in the Mark's Battle theme from Kirby Superstar, which uses a whole host of different time signatures to keep the player unbalanced and on edge. This concept will be important when we come back to discuss Ocarina of Time later in the series. Volume, or dynamic, is usually altered on pause or menu screens. Fading the music at these points helps the player focus on their task and avoids fatigue. Mixing tracks to bring out certain melodies or instruments can be used to demonstrate progress within the game's narrative, or to signify a change in the world around them. Digital signal processing, known as DSP, is a technique used to alter sounds as they are produced in-game. It can do this in various ways. Echo creates a delay of 50 milliseconds or more. As the name suggests, this gives the sound an echo-like effect, as if in a cave. Reverb. This mimics reflection off a surface within the game. It's similar to an echo, but often uses a much shorter delay. Chorus creates a small but constant delay, giving the effect of multiple voices. Time stretching alters the speed of the music without altering the pitch. Equalization, used to amplify or dampen certain frequencies within a sound, can create a heavy bass track or accentuate a treble melody line. Compression. In this context, compression reduces the dynamic range of the sound. Filtering. Specific frequencies can be targeted and altered by changing their volume, for example. It can also be used to apply any of the other effects to this single frequency. Using DSP to alter music in real time is much more efficient than creating several variations on a theme, and also allows for a much larger variety of changes. OpenForm uses algorithms to create new melodies based on predetermined material. This can be used to create unique tracks for each playthrough, but requires the composer to be totally aware of how each block of music fits together. It also risks the loss of any flow the original composition might have had. Perhaps one of the most complex processes used is branching paths and transformation matrices. In this case, the composition will contain several points at which a transition to another piece of music can take place, creating a branching path. A transformation matrix contains a series of small cues which the game can analyse and choose which fits into the current game state. Once again, the composer must be aware of how any two combinations may sound together. Conclusion. Video games as we know them stemmed from arcades, where bright flashing machines were accompanied by loud harsh music in order to entice customers into paying up. As home consoles developed, so too did sound quality and accessibility. Music was used to connect the player and the game, and various techniques kept memory restraints in check, such as loops and transitions. In the 80s, sound chips developed further, allowing composers to create even more realistic and complex soundscapes. Hindered by differences in region-locked hardware, MIDI was developed, creating a musical standard for composers to use. In the 90s, it was dropped in favour of more flexible CD-ROMs and other software designed to make composing for 3D environments much easier. The composition of a game's audio team can vary depending on genre and budget, but will usually be headed by the sound director and various designers, programmers, and developers. Other roles will be assigned when relevant, such as voice actors and composers. As with the personnel, the precise order of the game's production process will vary on genre, budget, and developer. It can be split into three broad stages. The pre-production stage sees the creation of an audio design document, detailing broad information about the style and integration of the game's audio. Spotting takes place to determine the use of ambience, and sound effects and music cues are organised into asset lists and music cue sheets respectively. Finally, a budget and schedule are created. In the production stage, Any live recordings will be created. Sound effects will be sourced and sweetened. Voice acting will be organised and recorded, along with any required retakes. Localisation translates all text and dialogue to the appropriate languages, as well as checking for any cultural or legal issues. Finally, the sound is integrated into the gameplay. This includes preparing for any player interactions and dynamic mixing. Finally, the post-production stage mixes the game's sound to prioritise more important audio, such as cues or dialogue. Testing will take place to ensure all audio matches any corresponding visual, and dialogue and text will undergo final checks for inconsistencies. Finally, I covered some of the most commonly used compositional techniques. These range from simple concepts, such as shifting pitch, harmony, or tempo, to more complex ideas, such as algorithmic openform and branching path. These can be used to create new music easily and save on memory usage. Each also has unique effects on the player. This video has been a bit of a mashup of lots of different things that you'll need to know to understand what comes later in the series. It's by no means a comprehensive guide to any of these areas, but it gives you a basic understanding of the industry, how it works, and how we got here. I've included some references, so if you want to read up on anything mentioned in this video, I highly recommend checking them out. As always, if you have any questions not answered by these references, you can get in touch with me in various places. If I can't answer you directly, I can probably point you in the direction of someone who can. The video will also be uploaded to my YouTube channel shortly after this stream. Now that we've covered what the industry is about, we can begin to pick it apart a little. Next week, I'll be highlighting some of the main identifying features of video game music. You might assume it's just the same as movie soundtracks, but there are actually many key differences. I'll discuss these, and the reasons behind them, next week.